Picture this: an empire at its height, its palaces dripping with gold, its rulers feared by the world. But behind those marble walls, one man's hunger for power and pleasure would drive a dynasty into madness. His name was Murad IV, the Ottoman Sultan whose rule was carved in blood, fear, and forbidden desire. He was both saint and sinner, conqueror and captive of his own obsessions. Tonight, we uncover the scandal the empire tried to erase forever. The Ottoman Empire was once the beating heart of the world. Vast, opulent, and unstoppable. From the sands of Arabia to the walls of Vienna, its banners declared divine authority. But within the grand palaces of Istanbul, behind the jeweled gates of Topkapi, power often rotted from within. It was an empire built on faith and discipline, yet its rulers were men, flawed, ambitious, and at times consumed by temptation. Murad IV, born in 1612, ascended the throne at just 11 years old during one of the empire's most chaotic eras. The court was drowning in corruption, the Janissaries rebelled, and the empire's moral fabric was unraveling. But the boy who took the throne would grow into a man feared for both his righteousness and his cruelty. History remembers Murad IV as the sultan who banned alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, but secretly indulged in the very vices he condemned. His reign became a mirror of hypocrisy and control, a portrait of power twisted by obsession. This is not just the tale of a ruler. It's the unraveling of a man who became a legend for all the wrong reasons. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts below. The year was 1623, and the great city of Constantinople trembled under the weight of its own chaos. The empire that once ruled 3 continents was now rotting from within. The air hung heavy with the scent of smoke and rebellion. Drunken soldiers roamed the streets, ministers whispered treachery in candlelit rooms, and the once mighty Ottoman throne sat nearly empty. The Sultan, Mustafa IV, had lost his mind, and the Janissaries, those elite soldiers sworn to protect the empire, had become its most dangerous threat. In the midst of this turmoil, an 11-year-old boy was dragged from his chambers and crowned emperor. His name was Murad, son of Sultan Ahmed III. The boy's eyes, wide with fear, reflected the gilded ceilings of Topkapi Palace, where courtiers bowed not out of loyalty, but out of desperation. For the first time in centuries, the empire's fate rested in the trembling hands of a child. At first, Murad IV was little more than a symbol, a puppet for the scheming ministers and his mother, Kosum Sultan, the formidable Queen Mother, who truly held power. She was intelligent, calculating, and fiercely protective of her son. But even she could not control the storm that brewed beyond the palace walls. Rebellion and corruption had seeped into every corner of the empire. Governors hoarded gold while peasants starved. The Janissaries, once loyal defenders of the Sultan, drank in public and mocked their sovereign. Murad watched this all from behind. Screens and latticed windows, too young to act, but old enough to understand the humiliation. Each day, he saw the empire slipping further from the grasp of his bloodline, and with every insult whispered in the corridors of power, something darker began to take root inside him, a slow, smoldering fury. Years passed, and the boy became a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed. The court's corruption only deepened. and Murad's patience thinned like the edge of a blade. The empire was bleeding, and he decided that fear would be its only cure. By the time he turned 20, he seized power completely, pushing aside his mother and executing the ministers who had once controlled him. What followed was one of the most brutal transformations in Ottoman history. The gentle boy became a tyrant, a man whose sense of justice was so absolute that it devoured mercy itself. Murad IV ruled like a thunderstorm, unpredictable and merciless. His word was law, and his anger was death. To restore order, he imposed the harshest prohibitions the empire had ever seen. No drinking, no gambling, no tobacco, and no coffee. The coffee houses, once hubs of poetry and politics, were shut down. Spies patrolled the streets. Even the whisper of rebellion could send a man to the gallows. But here's the chilling part. The very vices Murad outlawed would soon become his secret refuge. Imagine walking the streets of Istanbul under his rule. The city that once thrived with laughter and music now moved in terrified silence. The call to prayer echoed across the Bosphorus like a warning. By day, Murad appeared, the embodiment of discipline, a sultan restoring divine order. But by night, he shed that mask. Disguised in plain clothes, he would slip out of the palace, roaming the taverns and shadowed alleys of his own empire, seeking out the forbidden pleasures he had banned. To the people, he was the enforcer of purity. To himself, he was a prisoner of his contradictions. He drank heavily, indulging in wine imported from Europe, and surrounded himself with those who fed his appetite for danger and dominance. Witnesses spoke of his laughter turning to rage in an instant, of servants beaten for a glance too long, of banquets that ended in sudden executions. And yet, the city loved him, or rather, they feared him so completely that fear became a form of reverence. But Murad's tyranny was not born only from cruelty. It was carved from fear. Fear of weakness, fear of betrayal, fear of the same corruption that had once controlled his youth. He believed the empire could only be saved through absolute obedience. And so, he made examples of his enemies. Thousands were executed under his rule, their bodies displayed along the palace walls as warnings. He personally patrolled the streets at night, wielding his sword against lawbreakers. To his followers, he was a ruler chosen by God to cleanse the empire. To his victims, he was a ghost in the dark, silent, swift, and merciless. One chronicler wrote that Murad's eyes burned like coals, as if the angels themselves feared his judgment. Yet, behind that fire was a loneliness so vast it hollowed him from within. He trusted no one, not even his own blood. Those closest to him were often the first to die. Inside the palace, his paranoia grew. He saw conspiracies in every corner, treason in every smile. His relationship with his mother, once his greatest strength, turned into resentment. He accused Kösem Sultan of manipulation, of secretly guiding the empire behind his back. Their bond fractured, and she was forced into silence. Servants learned to move like shadows, speaking only when spoken to. Even the imperial harem, once a sanctuary of beauty and intrigue, became a place of fear. The walls of Topkapi echoed not with music, but with the muffled cries of those who had angered him. Yet Murad's cruelty came with strange flashes of brilliance. He reorganized the army, crushed rebellions, and reclaimed lost territories. He restored discipline to a nation that had nearly collapsed. Under his iron rule, the empire became strong again, but at a terrible cost. The peace he created was built not on harmony, but on silence. And still, he could not escape his own demons. The more he punished others for sin, the deeper he sank into his own. He turned his palace into both court and prison, holding lavish feasts where wine flowed like rivers. The very act he'd made a capital crime. Ministers who dared remind him of his own laws were executed on the spot. Historians wrote of him wandering the palace gardens at night, speaking to the ghosts of his victims and laughing to himself. He surrounded himself with musicians, jesters, and poets, demanding they praise his glory one moment and sentencing them to death the next. His power had become a performance, a ritual of dominance designed to hide the decay eating at his soul. By his late 20s, Murad was both emperor and captive, his empire an extension of his own unraveling mind. He had cleansed the Ottoman court of corruption, but in doing so, he had replaced it with something far darker, a reign that blurred the line between divine justice and madness. And in that darkness, his legend, the scandal that would haunt the empire, began to take shape. By the early 1630s, Murad IV's iron grip had reshaped the empire into an image of rigid control and secret decay. The streets of Istanbul were spotless, silent, and suffocating under his laws. The coffee houses, once alive with debate, stood shuttered, their doors sealed with wax as if to bury ideas themselves. No man dared raise his voice, no woman dared walk unveiled near the palace gates, and yet, within those same walls, Murad's nights burned with forbidden excess. Power had turned him into his own contradiction, a ruler who preached purity by day and drowned in indulgence by night. And slowly, that contradiction began to consume him. The court whispered of secret chambers deep beneath Topkapi, where Murad hosted gatherings that defied every law he had created. He would arrive dressed in silk robes stitched with gold, his eyes glazed with intoxication, his laughter echoing off the marble as if mocking the empire he once vowed to purify. He had outlawed pleasure, but turned it into a private religion, one in which he was both God and sinner. Imagine being there, a courtier standing in the flickering glow of torches, watching the sultan shift between laughter and fury like a man haunted by his own reflection. His attendants trembled at the sound of his voice. One wrong glance, one nervous twitch, could mean death. Yet they obeyed, trapped in the orbit of a ruler who demanded both devotion and fear. Some chroniclers described him as possessed, a man whose soul had been split between divine will and human craving. And in that split, the seeds of scandal took root. Murad's hypocrisy became the empire's open secret. The more he punished others, the more reckless he became himself. He would order executions in the morning, then spend the night undoing every moral code he enforced. His punishments were now performances, acts of domination designed not to restore order, but to remind everyone that no one, not even God, could restrain him. The palace became a theater of power, its corridors echoing with dread and whispered prayers. Outside the palace, the empire bled quietly. The provinces groaned under heavy taxes, soldiers went unpaid, and rebellions simmered like coals under ash. But Murad was blind to their suffering. He had turned inward, obsessed with the illusion of control. He ordered the construction of elaborate gardens where he could retreat from reality. Gardens filled with fountains of wine and walls of mirrors that reflected him endlessly. Witnesses said he would wander there for hours, talking to his own reflection, asking it whether the world still feared him. He surrounded himself with flatterers who assured him of his greatness, even as famine and unrest spread through Anatolia. When news of revolt reached his ears, he responded not with mercy, but with rage. He personally led campaigns across the empire, riding at the front of his army with a sword in one hand and a goblet in the other. The soldiers followed in terrified awe, calling him the Shadow of God, though many whispered that he had long since lost God's favor. And yet, despite the cruelty, there was a strange brilliance in his madness. Murad IV's military campaigns crushed the Persian threat and reclaimed Baghdad, a victory that restored the empire's pride. He rode through the conquered city like a triumphant god, draped in silver armor that shimmered beneath the sun. The people cheered, the soldiers knelt, and the chroniclers wrote of him as a second Alexander. But behind that victory lay a heart that had turned to stone. He executed his own commanders for the smallest failures, burned villages suspected of rebellion, and ordered entire families slaughtered for treason. He believed the empire could only live if its people feared him more than death itself. And so, fear became the oxygen of his reign. Baghdad's triumph marked the height of his power and the beginning of his fall. Because when Murad returned to Constantinople, the city felt smaller. The cheers faded. The triumph gave way to silence. Victory had given him everything, and nothing. He became restless, angry at the stillness of peace. The routines of ruling bored him. The ceremonies of court felt hollow. He sought new ways to feel alive. He would wake his guards in the middle of the night and ride through the empty streets, disguised as a commoner, hunting for those who dared break his own laws. He delighted in the irony, the ruler of all the faithful disguised as a sinner among them. When he found a man drinking or smoking, he would reveal himself and execute the lawbreaker on the spot. The act thrilled him. It made him feel like justice incarnate, even as he reeked of wine. But here's the chilling part. His victims often recognized him and begged for mercy, calling him my sultan, only to be struck down by the same hand they worshipped. It was justice without reason, punishment without end. The palace chroniclers began to notice the change. Murad grew quieter, his rage colder, his paranoia sharper. He began to see enemies in every shadow. He accused his own brothers of plotting against him. Some historians say he ordered their deaths to protect the throne. Others believe it was to silence the last voices that reminded him of his humanity. He trusted no one, not even the doctors who tended to him. His health began to fail. The years of drinking had taken their toll. His liver was failing, his body bloated, his hands trembling. Yet he refused to admit weakness. A sultan does not fall, he once told his physician. The world kneels before him. But the world was already turning its back. Ministers plotted quietly for succession, servants whispered prayers behind closed doors, and Kosem Sultan, the mother he had once banished, waited in silence, knowing that the empire would soon belong to death. One night, as the storm raged over the Bosphorus, Murad locked himself in his private chamber. The guards heard him shouting, not at anyone visible, but at the walls, at the mirrors, at the shadows that bore his face. He screamed of betrayal, of sins too great for forgiveness, of ghosts that would not leave him. The torches flickered, and for hours no one dared enter. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, his eyes hollow. He ordered a feast, one last night of music, wine, and defiance. Witnesses said he drank until he could no longer stand, toasting the empire he had built on fear. "Let the angels judge me," he whispered, "for no man dares." The next morning, the great Sultan Murad IV was carried to his bed, his body collapsing under the weight of years of excess and guilt. The empire waited, holding its breath. The man who had once claimed the throne of the world now lay motionless, beneath silk sheets, his pulse fading like a candle in the wind. But his story was not over, because what happened after his death would reveal the true depth of his scandal. The morning Murad IV's chamber fell silent. A strange calm settled over the palace. Outside, the seagulls wheeled over the Bosphorus, oblivious to the shift in power that was unfolding beneath the golden domes. Inside Topkapi Palace, ministers and eunuchs gathered in the corridors, speaking in whispers. They had seen him drink, beyond reason, the night before. They had heard his laughter turn into screams. Now, the ruler who had made the empire tremble lay unconscious, his face as pale as marble. Physicians rushed to his bedside, armed with elixirs and prayers, but it was too late. His body, ravaged by years of excess, had finally surrendered. The man who had once believed himself invincible was now just another mortal gasping for breath. Kosum Sultan, his mother, stood at the door, silent, her face unreadable. She had loved him once, feared him always, and now watched him fade into history. Murad's eyes flickered open one last time. "Do not let them see me weak," he whispered. Those were his final words, a fitting command for a ruler who had spent his life hiding his own humanity. News of his death spread through Constantinople like a whisper through a tomb. The people did not celebrate, nor did they mourn. They simply waited. After years of terror, silence felt foreign. The city that had once trembled at his footsteps now listened to the wind, unsure whether to breathe again. Inside the palace, the cleanup began, not of his body, but of his legacy. His attendants burned documents, destroyed letters, erased traces of his hidden life. The Ottoman chroniclers, writing under the orders of the new court, carefully edited his story, shaping it into something more palatable for history. They recorded him as a conqueror, a restorer of order, a sultan chosen by fate to save the empire. But beneath those official words lay the truth, that Murad IV's rule had been one of both greatness and decay, brilliance and madness. Those who had seen his private side, the side of indulgence and cruelty, knew that the empire's order had come at the cost of its soul. And though they never spoke of it openly, his scandal lived on in the spaces between their silences. Imagine walking through the palace corridors after his passing. The air still carries his presence, the faint scent of smoke and wine, the echo of boots striking marble floors. The servants move carefully, as if afraid to disturb his ghost. His throne remains untouched, draped in black velvet, guarded by men who had once feared even to meet his eyes. The empire breathes, but uneasily. The people whisper that Murad's spirit still roams the city, disguised as a beggar, testing those who break his laws. In the taverns, storytellers murmur tales of the sultan who punished sin but lived within it, a ruler who fought corruption only to drown in his own. Some call him a hypocrite, others a tragic prophet consumed by his mission. His enemies curse his memory, his loyalists praise his discipline. But all agree on one thing: no one who lived under his rule ever forgot the sound of his name. Historians would later argue that Murad IV's cruelty saved the Ottoman Empire from collapse. His campaigns in Persia, his restoration of order, his crushing of rebellion, all strengthened the state that might otherwise have fractured. And yet, those same historians admit that his legacy left behind a blueprint for tyranny. Every ruler after him would study his methods, the control, the fear, the surveillance, and find in them both inspiration and warning. Murad had proven that absolute power could bring stability, but only through terror. He had turned leadership into domination, justice into paranoia. His story became a mirror in which every sultan who followed saw the reflection of his own potential for corruption. In that way, Murad IV never truly died. His spirit lingered in the empire's politics, its palaces, its whispered conspiracies. Even a century later, when the Ottomans faced decline, old scholars would mutter, "What this empire needs is another Murad." They said it not with hope, but with fear. And yet, for all his darkness, there was something undeniably human about Murad's tragedy. He was a man shaped by betrayal, raised in fear, and handed power before he could understand its weight. His cruelty was born not only from lust or arrogance, but from a desperate need to control what once controlled him. The boy who had seen his empire mock his family had grown into a man determined never to be mocked again. Every prohibition, every execution, every sleepless night was his attempt to silence the chaos he had inherited. But power cannot silence chaos. It only hides it, waiting to return. In the end, Murad became the very thing he feared, a ruler consumed by his own demons. The scandal of his life was not just his indulgence or brutality, but the tragedy of a man who destroyed himself trying to destroy weakness. There's an old Ottoman saying, "Even the lion fears his reflection in still water." Murad IV was that lion. He conquered armies, silenced rebels, commanded nations, but when he faced himself, he could not bear what he saw. His reflection, the boy who once trembled behind palace screens, never disappeared. It haunted him in every act of violence, every cup of wine, every moment of silence before dawn. And when death finally took him, it was almost merciful. His brother Ibrahim succeeded him, a weak and unstable ruler who would undo much of Murad's work. Some saw it as poetic justice, the empire punishing itself for its sins. Others saw it as a curse, the lingering consequence of Murad's unrelenting grip. Either way, his death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a myth. Today, historians still argue over who Murad IV truly was, a hero or a monster, a savior or a tyrant. Perhaps he was all of them. His reign remains one of the most paradoxical in history, a time of restoration built on destruction, of purity enforced through sin. And though the archives of the Ottoman Empire are filled with his decrees, his letters, his edicts of morality, they can never capture the man behind them, the lonely, frightened soul who ruled the world and lost himself in the process. When you strip away the titles, the crowns, and the legends, what remains is a question that echoes through time. Can power ever exist without corruption? Murad IV's life answered that question not with words, but with the silence he left behind. A silence that still lingers in the halls of Topkapi, in the whispering winds of the Bosphorus, in the memory of an empire that both loved and feared its most perverted ruler. History remembers rulers by the empires they built, but it judges them by the shadows they left behind. Murad IV's reign was a masterpiece of contradictions. Order born from terror, faith twisted into fear, strength that hid deep weakness. He ruled an empire and yet could never master himself. And maybe that's what makes his story timeless. Because behind every throne, in every age, lies the same fragile truth: that power without restraint always turns inward. The story of Murad IV isn't just about an emperor who lost his soul. It's about every human who's ever believed that control could quiet chaos, that discipline could erase desire, that fear could buy loyalty. In the end, his empire survived. But he didn't. His laws faded, his victories crumbled, but his warning endures like an echo through history. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what kind of forgotten rulers, dark empires, or ancient scandals you'd like to see next. Until then, remember, sometimes the brightest crowns hide the darkest hearts.